Excellent. Okay, well, welcome everybody to our panel discussion on municipal democracy in a digital age. And we're really lucky to have two wonderful speakers, both experts in the field. And let me just introduce them both. I guess I'll first of all just say a little bit about our topic. We've certainly been thinking about the impact of the digital age on democracy. Just pick up any newspaper and there'll be discussions of, the trolling of candidates, the rise in social media, decline of traditional media. What we're interested in is, given that the Kingston's municipal elections, along with other municipalities, now involve online voting, what are the democratic implications? How does it work? How is it regulated? So our two speakers are Nicole Goodman and Aleks Essex. So let me just say a little bit about them both. Aleks Essex is Associate Professor of Software Engineering in the Department of Electrical and Computing Engineering at Western University. He specializes in cybersecurity and applied cryptography, I guess, and runs the Whisper Lab, the Western Information Security and Privacy Research Laboratory. Dr. Essex is concerned to secure our democratic institutions in the digital age through the development and standardization of trustworthy, publicly accountable election practices and technology. And among his areas of research are privacy-preserving health informatics. That means developing technology that can help medical researchers get access to important health data while working within privacy laws. Trustworthy elections is another interest of his, designing technology and standards to secure electronic and online voting systems and provide evidence that the results are accurate while protecting ballot secrecy. Data privacy, identifying the privacy impact of new technologies like machine learning, mobile apps, and so forth. Dr. Essex has a number of publications on these issues, often collaborating with our other panelist, Dr. Nicole Goodman, including their recently published paper, A Cyber Threat Analysis of Online Voting in Canada. And you may also have encountered Dr. Essex on the CBC or in the newspaper. He's often being interviewed in the media about his research and his findings. So welcome, Aleks. Welcome, Dr. Essex. Lovely to have you here. And let me introduce our other speaker. Our other speaker is Nicole Goodman, who's Associate Professor in Political Science at Brock University. Her recent research focuses on the effects of digital technology on Canadian political institutions and actors, with an emphasis on political behavior and public policy. The core focus of this research is the adoption of technology in elections, on which Nicole is writing a book. She also studies political participation, public policy, Indigenous politics, and local government. Dr. Goodman recently led a study of the 2014 Ontario municipal elections to assess the effects of internet voting on voters and election administration in 47 municipalities. And she's currently part of two multi-year funded research projects involving business, government, and community partnerships to understand the impact of digital technology on Canadian cities and Indigenous communities on such matters as voting behavior, citizen participation, Indigenous self-determination, changes in the efficiency and quality of government service delivery and governance more broadly. Findings from her recent research have been presented in testimony to the Standing Committee on the Legislative Assembly, Ontario, and the Special Committee on Electoral Reform, as well as widely in the media. So welcome, Dr. Goodman. Welcome, Dr. Essex. Wonderful to have you here. We're really honored to have experts such as yourselves talk to us. And I'll now just turn the floor over to Dr. Essex. Thank you.
Wow, what a lovely introduction. I'm not used to such high praise and lengthy introductions. I'm just regular old Alex, but I do want to talk to you about online voting. And this is a very interesting topic. I mean, not just because we just went through an election in Ontario at the municipal level that saw the greatest adoption of online voting in the province's history, one of the greatest worldwide, but because of the particularities, the peculiarities of the Ontario case, we're kind of different in some good ways and some not so good ways. So how do I take a really complicated topic like this and kind of boil it down into something that is not as short as one of those CBC interviews maybe, but still, short enough you can kind of get the gist of it. So I was thinking about it tonight, and I think I've got a way to explain it. So I'm going to try this out on you. It's a story. It's not a true story, but the facts of the case that it's built on are true. So it's coming from a place of truth, even though the names are made up to protect the innocent. So this story is about a man named Joe who owns a candy franchise in the province of Ontario. So he has 10 locations throughout Ontario that sell candy. And in the 2021 tax year, Joe took in $1 million in revenue, which I guess is a lot for a candy franchise, but I guess he's just got enough locations. He's got $1 million of revenue in candy. But when he filed his tax return, he remitted $0 HST to CRA. Now, that's not impossible, but it's very surprising that a candy store franchise would remit $0 in HST. So CRA looks at Joe's tax return and says, we're going to need some more information. So they contact Joe and they say, look, this is not a lot of HST for the amount of revenue that you've reported on your tax. Can you tell us what's going on here? And then Joe responds to CRA by saying, don't worry, I punched the numbers into the TurboTax and it told me I don't owe you any HST. And then CRA says, yeah, we're not really interested in what tax software you use. We want to know about the numbers. We want to see the numbers. And then Joe responds by saying, look, everyone uses the TurboTax. I'm sure it gave you the right answer. I don't need to, I mean, I've told you what I know. The TurboTax says I don't owe you any HST. So CRA goes back and thinks about it and they say, something doesn't feel right here. We're going to need to audit Joe's candy store. So they go to Joe and they say, all right, Joe, I'm very sorry to inform you that you're being audited. And then Joe responds by saying, no, I'm not audited and I'm not showing you my books. Thank you very much for your interest, but no. And CRA says, what? We're the CRA, you can't say no. What are you thinking? And Joe says, look, talk to my lawyer. I'm not cooperating. I'm really very sorry, but I reported everything correctly and that's enough. So CRA goes to federal judge and says, we need a court order to get access to Joe's financial records for this candy company because, we have reason to believe something's wrong here. And now imagine the judge says to the CRA, well, do you have evidence that Joe has committed tax fraud? And they say, well, no. If there was evidence, it would be in his financial records, which we are seeking to have access to. And now imagine the federal judge says, well, if you don't have evidence of wrongdoing, I'm really very sorry, we can't grant you that court order. And then the CRA says, well, what are you talking about? Like, how can you deny us that? I mean, we need to know so we can collect taxes correctly. And the CRA says, well, look, the federal judge says, look, the law is very clear that Joe is allowed to set his own standard for accounting. And under that standard, he appears to have followed everything. And then the CRA says, in what world does a corporation get to set the standard for their own tax accounting? Now, the answer to that question is that world is Ontario, and it's not tax accounting, it's democratic elections and the results of democratic elections as done through online voting. What we are seeing in the province of Ontario is democratic elections being run in municipalities using online voting systems. And it's akin to a business doing its daily operations, and at the end, they're reporting a result. In the Democratic case, the result is the outcome of the election. And then in this analogy, it's the financials, the tax remittance at the end of the year. Now, unlike the real world of CRA, where you have to open your books for them if they ask, no such law or precedent exists in Ontario. The clerks are allowed to set their own standard, their own procedures for the conduct of the election. And to this date, at least to my knowledge, and I'm not a lawyer, but I'm very well immersed in this world, we're not aware of any litigation that has explored this issue of auditing the results of elections, demonstrating that the results are correct. Any recounts that might be ordered on online voting results are just done using the same software. Now, why is this a problem? Well, if you've ever scrutineered an Elections Canada election, so I've been a poll worker in Elections Canada and Elections Ontario, they have a paper ballot. And at the end of the night, you stand there counting up the ballots, and scrutineers are standing there watching you do it. So they count along with you, okay? Now imagine that I was working that election and I say, you know what, listen, it would go a lot faster if you guys weren't breathing down my neck. And I picked up the box and I walked into a room and closed the door. I was in there for a while, you couldn't see what I was doing, and then I come out with the totals. This is just not the way that we should be running elections. Certainly not if you run in the election and then lose unexpectedly in the election, you're gonna not feel very good about that. Unfortunately, this is the level of transparency with which these online elections are being offered. So, there seems to be some confusion, when some of the Ontario municipal clerks listen to my CBC interviews, they think I'm against online voting, and that is not correct. Just to make sure that the record is perfectly clear, I am against elections that have unexplained outcomes, where no independent evidence is produced that would allow a losing candidate to feel satisfied by the outcome. A reasonable candidate, of course, we have seen unreasonable candidates south of the border, but that's a separate story. So we're in a very troubled place in Ontario where we're not getting the transparency that would be appropriate for a democratic election. Nobody seems to be particularly concerned about it. And there's no laws or legislative agenda or initiative to renew those laws to account for the fact that we are no longer counting paper ballots at a church or school in front of the candidate scrutineers, but rather counting it up behind essentially a digital closed door. So that is something that Dr. Goodman and I are trying to work towards a brighter future where we can have our online cake and have the transparency of that approach as well. Unfortunately, that has not been an easy process. We've been involved in this for many years now. And the solution in Ontario will eventually have to be either a legal or political one. Now, I'm a computer scientist, so what do I know about that world? All I can do is point to the technology and say, this is what I see the technology doing, or rather, in this case, not doing. Thank you for that. That's just a sort of a brief kind of an analogy of what we're dealing with. And of course, after Dr. Goodman gives her introduction, I'd be happy to open this up into questions.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Aleks. Thank you. Terrific. Got lots to chew on there. Great. So that we'll move to Dr. Goodman after we've had Dr. Essex's computer scientist perspective, and now we'll move to Dr. Goodman's political scientist perspective. So if you can, I think you're a co-host, Nicole, so maybe you can upload your slides if you'd like.
Yes, I'm just going to pull that up right now.
Terrific. Thank you.
Second here. Hold on, just one sec. Apologies for the recording. I'm just trying to connect my second monitor, and it was supposed gonna work. Thank goodness. This is a tenuous thing. All right. Yeah. Okay, just one second. I'm gonna pull them up. View, whoops. Hold on. Oh, I have to share my screen first. Okay, share. It's gonna look messy for a second. Just know that this means I'm very productive. Hold on. Okay, share.
I've been there. I understand.
This drives some people crazy. Okay. All right, please work. Okay, great. So you folks can see the full slide, is that right?
Yeah, perfect. Wonderful.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here today, and a special thanks to Christine for inviting me. I'm excited to be with you. My presentation is a little bit longer than Alex's, and a little more involved. I hope that's okay. 20 minutes, right?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. And I'm just going to keep my camera off just while I talk. I'm recovering from a head injury, and it's just easier for me, but I'm happy to put my camera on and see all your faces for questions at the end. Okay, so I'm going to be talking to you today about online elections. It'll be like an overview. So I'm going to be talking about, what online voting is, its benefits and drawbacks, some of the main, side effects, good and bad. And then I'll end talking about regulation and where I think the future of digital elections is going in a municipal context. Great, so let's go ahead. Okay, so with respect to online voting, there's multiple ways that online voting can take place. In the literature that we talk about online voting being held at a polling place, which would be a regular poll location. It can be held at a kiosk, which is not a polling place. This is a centralized location, like maybe a library or a community center. Kiosk online voting is located in an area there that isn't a polling location, so you may be frequenting. But it's still supervised by election officials. So election officials still maintain some control, and the goal is to provide electors with greater accessibility. And then, of course, on the other end, you have remote online voting, and there's various types of remote online voting. In the US, for example, they have email and fax voting, which may be done partially online or fully online, depending. What I mean by that is you might have a type of email voting where a voter receives a ballot by email, but then has to send back a paper version, or vice versa. Or you might have a receipt online and being sent online. But the kind of remote online voting that we have in Canada, specifically in Ontario, is fully remote. So ballots are being received, they're being completed, they're being cast, they're being returned, and they're being tabulated, all in one system via an internet connection. And that's an important distinction to make. So when we're speaking about online voting tonight, we're mainly speaking about remote online voting. While select municipalities offer kiosk online voting, they may not call it that, but that's what it is. And polling place online voting, the bulk of individuals who are using this service are using the remote online voting. And this is the type of voting where you can vote in your pajamas. There was a candidate in Cambridge, actually, a couple of elections ago, who marketed himself in a nude picture saying that you could vote online from home. So I'm not sure if he ended up winning or not. So in terms of where it's adopted, I think this is important for context. It's adopted all over the country at various levels, and it's definitely growing, but the hub of online voting is truly Ontario. So this map is updated with the 2022 election data, and you can see it's a map of Ontario. It's cutting off a bit of the north, but you can see, depending on if it's white, they've never used online voting, and then depending on the shade of red indicates the number of elections in which a municipality has used online voting. And there are some cases where a municipality has, made the move to use online voting, and then they've decided not to, and they reverted adoption. Guelph would be an example of that. But for the most part, we've seen tremendous growth since it was first introduced in 2003. So in 2003, 12 municipalities and townships across the province used it. There was 11 smaller ones, and Markham, the city of Markham, which is perhaps the best known case in Canada. And from there, that number increased to 20, and then 44, and then 97, and then 177. And then I still need to double check these numbers, but around 233 in the 2022 municipal elections. And just to put that in context for you, there are 444 municipalities in Ontario, and 414 of them run elections. So out of those 414 that run elections, we're having 233, adopt online voting, which is quite a bit, and it's now the majority of municipalities in the province. So Ontario is definitely the hub of online voting activity in our country. And in fact, it's probably actually the biggest case of online voting in the world right now. Estonia also has a very well-established program like Ontario, but they just don't have the same population that we do. So as a function of that, we probably have greater use. It's also used in Nova Scotia at the municipal level. It's used among Indigenous communities, First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities. And I should mention, now that I'm saying this, at the beginning of the slide, I should make sure I give credit. A lot of this work has been collaborated and developed with other individuals through different research projects. And so I didn't take a moment, and I should now, to acknowledge those individuals, because this research wouldn't be possible without their wonderful collaboration. And Aleks is obviously one of those individuals. Amanda Tieber, Chelsea Gable, Helen Hayes, Mike McGregor, Zach Spicer, and Scott Prusers. So thank you to them. So yeah, lots of use among Indigenous communities. It was first used in a First Nation in 2011, and use has skyrocketed since then, particularly with the pandemic. We saw a lot of use increase. In terms of at the subnational level, Elections PEI held a plebiscite on electoral reform. This was a non-binding plebiscite in 2016, where they used online voting for the first time at the subnational level. It has since been used by Elections Northwest Territories for absentee voters in 2019. And of course, that agency has plans to continue to use it. And it was actually most recently used just this past month in October, leading into November in Elections Yukon's school board elections. And there are plans to use it in Nova Scotia. They currently have an RFP out for their 2026 election. And Quebec also recently released an RFP, not necessarily committing to use the technology, but they are looking for bids to explore it, let's say. So all of that to say, there is activity at higher levels of government now. And despite calls on the federal government to investigate this voting reform, Elections Canada did some research, almost a decade ago now, actually. And the Special Committee for Electoral Reform, considering this along with mandatory voting and broader system reform, there's been no moves to modernize those elections any more than they already have been with the online registration and the electronic list. Otherwise, they're staying very, very manual. Okay, so this is a chart that just kind of maps out the different phases of online voting adoption, just to kind of give you a sense. And, I don't have the time to necessarily go into the context here, but there are these models of diffusion of innovation that make an argument that, over time, there's kind of these phases or cycles where a type of technology is adopted by society, in this case, governments. And so you can see, the phase one, which would have been back in 2003, we had the innovators. Phase two, I say, is from 2006 to 2010. Phase three from 2014 to 2018. And then we're moving into the late majority phase of adoption right now. And there's a number of different aspects that, distinguish these phases. And I'm just going to speak briefly to a few of those. So in terms of like the authentication approach, some of you, if you voted online in the election, you may have noticed this. The authentication approach is how, a city or whoever the clerk's office running the election confirms that you are who you say you are. So how do we confirm that Christine is indeed Christine? Well, in some voting models, Christine may be expected to enter in a unique PIN code. In some cases, this can be alphanumeric. In other cases, it may just be numeric. And we would also expect Christine usually to enter in a second secret credential that only Christine presumably knows, or, one of the only few people that knows. And date of birth is an example of that is used readily. That's called a one-step system. So a one-step system with your, date of birth and with your PIN, which is usually located on your voter notification card or voter information card, depending what it's called in different municipalities, you can access and cast your ballot. In other places, there's this two-step approach where you're required to register online first. And, this is designed to create this extra step to potentially reduce someone trying to compromise or take your ballot. And it does require an email address. So it's a little bit more arduous, particularly for the elderly who, may not be as digitally literate. And so, we've seen traditionally smaller municipalities using this one-step approach and larger municipalities using the two-step approach. However, that has shifted in recent years, and we're seeing predominantly a one-step system, not in all cases, definitely not in all cases, but predominantly. And some municipalities actually in this election even dropped date of birth. Then we have voting period length that has changed over the years. At the beginning, small municipalities would offer it in the full election. So they would offer it in the advance polls and on election day. And in many cases, there would be no more distinguishing between advance polls and election day. I mean, yes, you would distinguish them, but it would just be one period, let's say. Do you know what I mean? There wouldn't be a couple days before, it would just be a period. And larger places would use it in the advance polls. And we're seeing a shift there where predominantly it's just offered for the full election now. But there has been a little bit of scale back, and I'm going to talk about that in a couple of slides. And then in terms of multi-channel voting, which basically means telephone voting, we've seen telephone voting used historically. It started being used because one of the vendors, offered it as a value add package, and to compete, the other vendors had to go along with that. However, that has been somewhat scaled back in some municipalities since the 2018 election. And again, I'll get into that. Many of you may not know that many places in Ontario actually offer all electronic elections. So we are the only jurisdiction of which I am aware in the world to offer a fully electronic election remotely and eliminate paper voting. There are other countries like Mexico and India, Brazil, that do run fully electronic elections, but there is a greater component of supervision associated with those elections. The types of technology and regulatory framework. So the types of technology that are being used, happy to speak to this in the Q&A, are changing. And in terms of a regulatory framework, again, Canada as an outlier. Canada remains the only country, again, of which I am aware in my research, that readily uses these technologies to such a degree, yet has no regulation. Now that is changing, it's in development. Aleks and I together put in a proposal in December 2020 to the CIO Strategy Council, and it was accepted, and we have been working with them to develop standards. And there's also a twin standards process going on that Elections Ontario has started, not for online voting, but for e-poll books and tabulators, but that's equally noteworthy. Anyways, okay, so that is just a sense of like, what is online voting? How does it work? What does it look like? Where is it used? So now, maybe I'll skip over this slide, but these are the arguments in favor and arguments against, and I'll get into talking about the benefits and drawbacks. So one of the main benefits often cited for online voting is accessibility. This principle that, electors can vote at any time. And certainly we see through the surveys that we've conducted that that is the case, that electors are, choosing to vote online because of convenience. So Christine mentioned in her lovely introduction, thank you, Christine, that I had done a survey in 2014, and that's true. And I've continued to actually do that in 2018 and in 2022. And so I can tell you, I just printed out the 2022 election results, and 72% of people who voted said that they voted online because of convenience. So that is the primary reason that voters are choosing to cast a ballot. However, it's important to note that, you know, some of you may say, oh, well, is it really improving access? Yes, we do find that it improves access, particularly among special groups of electors who may face additional barriers when casting a ballot. So I can speak to some of these. I mean, I can tell you personally, you know, as somebody who has like a permanent traumatic brain injury, I went through a period where, you know, I still struggle, obviously, sometimes, where I wasn't able to even go into a store. And so voting was really hard for me as a person with a disability. And, you know, the ability to vote online allowed me to take part. If it had to be in person, to be honest with you, I wouldn't have been able to do that. And so for other persons with disabilities, not only can online voting, you know, enable their vote, but it can sometimes level the playing field. So some electors require assistance when voting, and with online voting, we can add, you know, SIP and PUF applicators and other various types of attachments, which can allow these electors to vote unassisted for the first time, improving the equality of the vote. You know, especially for young people away at university, snowbirds out of town, for Indigenous voters, you know, really, really important to have these types of accessible measures, because it can really improve accessibility. And I have a statistic in there from one of the First Nations that I worked with Dr. Chelsea Gable, Wasauksing First Nation, which is near Parry Sound, Ontario. And, you know, we asked those voters, we said, would you like to have online voting? And we asked online voters, and yes, of course they would. And we also asked paper voters. So these were people who knew about online voting, but they decided not to vote online. And we said, would you support having online voting? And 63% of paper voters said that they would support the policy change. We see this in municipal data as well. And their rationale was 28% said that they would do it in all circumstances. So maybe this time it was just too new for them, you know? 35% said that they would use it in special circumstances. This is in cases where, you know, maybe there's inclement weather, maybe someone broke a leg, maybe you have to care for a sick child or a loved one. You know, in all of these kinds of cases where like life throws a wrench in our plans, online voting can help with that. It's not going to help with people who are apathetic and aren't interested in politics and don't care, but it can help with people who experience everyday life issues that might keep them from attending the polls. And it can also help to lower some of those barriers. And then for other people, you know, they comment, surprisingly, you may think that online voting offers greater privacy. So that's important. Just go forward here. Oops. Sorry, it's frozen. There we go. Okay, turnout. So this is the really big question that I'm sure all your ears are burning right now, wanting to know about turnout. Does online voting increase turnout? There are mixed findings from multiple studies around the world about this question. However, I'm not entirely convinced, because a lot of the other cases that have looked at it, they try and look at it across one or two elections. They're not looking at it at a series of elections over time. It's been difficult to collect data across country cases, and also often where online voting is used, it is honestly only used in a few elections typically before programs are canceled. The exceptions to that would be Estonia, Switzerland, Canada, and there's a couple of others, but it makes it hard to evaluate the impact of turnout. And so research from Canada does show that there is a statistically significant impact on voter turnout. I wanted to actually first comment, sorry, I'm just looking here, youth engagement. So oftentimes people will say, oh, is this a possible solution to get young people out? Because young people are like digitally inclined. And the answer is no, that the research shows that young people actually prefer, this is a generalization, so this is not speaking to every young person, because I'm sure there are some that just love to vote online, but generally young people prefer to vote by paper. These findings have been replicated in Norway and in the Netherlands. And, you know, we think it's because young people, it's one of their first voting opportunities, and it really is sort of a rite of passage for them. And so they enjoy having that voting experience. Okay, back to turnout. Sorry about that. So, you know, if we look anecdotally, we can see cases where turnout didn't increase. We can see cases where turnout, you know, did increase. And so Markham was, you know, the first larger municipality to use it. In 2003, they noted a 300% increase. That's not a typo. And then in 2006, a further 43% increase, and then no change in 2010. So, I mean, it is possible that there's a bit of a novelty effect going on there, but either way, the number of people who were casting ballots increased. And then with a colleague, Dr. Leah Stokes, we did a study where we looked at elections from 2000. So this is before online voting was adopted all the way to 2014. We looked at a number of municipalities and we found an increase of 3.5 percentage points. And if voting by mail was not in place beforehand, voting by mail is another convenience voting reform. We found that there was a 7 percentage point change. So that's actually larger than some studies have found, changing the electoral system from a single number plurality system to a proportional representation system. So that's interesting. And there have been a number of other newer studies that have come out. A recent study by Nicole Goodman looking at Switzerland, but looking specifically at expatriate voters, showing an increase. And then there's another study looking at expat voters in France or citizens abroad that also shows an increase for those specific groups. So overall, across countries, there isn't a consensus on whether it increases turnout, but in the Canadian context, the research that we have to date says that it does. Okay, other benefits quickly. So trust. So while trust in voting technology is context dependent, offering voters additional security measures like individual verifiability, let's say, which I'm sure Aleks would love to talk about, through a ballot tracker ID and ability to print a paper receipt of their voting transaction can perhaps boost confidence and trust in online voting, swaying some skeptics. Certainly in some studies that look at trust in elections in Latin America, officials have found that actually implementing digital technology in the voting process enhances trust. This isn't the case in all countries, but in some Latin American countries. It can reduce ballot errors and spoiled ballots, faster ballot tabulation, and of course can reduce environmental impact. I realize I'm at 20 minutes. So is it okay if I go 5 more minutes, Christine?
Certainly, yeah, sure, because Aleks was a bit short, so that's perfect, no problem at all.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so now I'm getting to the other side of the coin in case anyone's thinking, oh, she's just singing the praises of online voting. Well, I do really believe from my research, this is not a personal opinion, but that there are benefits. But of course, there are also risks. There are many pitfalls. So, a lot of these headlines that you're seeing here are from the 2018 election, where we had have to be careful. I was going to say a snafu. Aleks isn't going to like this. There was a technical incident that involved 43 municipalities on election night. So one of the vendors that was offering services, their systems slowed or in some cases stopped working in all of their municipal clients that were live at that time. And in some cases, this didn't affect voting too much because the municipality had paper voting available and the polls were open. But in some cases, it really did have an impact because in many of those municipalities, paper voting was eliminated, as I mentioned. And so the only option to vote was either online or online and telephone. And of course, both of those systems were affected. So 35 of those 43 municipalities declared a state of emergency, which they're required to do under the Municipal Elections Act, to continue voting the following day. And, as you can imagine, this isn't a great thing to have to do as a clerk. So this kind of example, first of all, this speaks to why we need standards. But second of all, it speaks to the potential risk exposure for online voting. Now, in this case, the provider noted that it was nothing to do with their technology. It was actually the arrangement that they had with a third-party provider who was providing bandwidth, their collocation provider. And there was a human error made on the part of the collocation provider who entered in the wrong number of bandwidth. And so bandwidth was restricted. And this wasn't noted, of course, until election day, because what happens on election day? Well, everybody decides to go out and vote. So everyone goes out to vote, and obviously it's putting a lot more strain on the system. And these people are prevented from voting. I think that is, yeah. So, this really highlights the importance of standards, and it also highlights the, risk exposure. Okay, sorry. There we go. Okay, so another concern, this is a snapshot of an article with the colleagues that are posted there, is if we're eliminating paper voting and we're running fully digital elections, are we potentially disenfranchising people? So obviously the argument to introduce online voting is to improve enfranchisement, right? It's to improve accessibility, to improve convenience. We know that it does this. We know that it, I'll speak to this in the Q&A if you like, but in multiple surveys across multiple elections, people are saying that they wouldn't have voted otherwise if online voting wasn't available. And we can actually see that people report less frequent voting histories when it comes to online voting than they do with paper voting. But the flip side of that is that if we take away paper voting, there could be an equal impact to the people that turn out. And so this paper with Mike McGregor, Jerome Couture, and Sandra Brew argues, based on data, that some electors are digitally disenfranchised over time when that happens. Okay, and so another downside, of course, is public opinion and public trust. So if we have these sort of snafus or technical incidents, there is the possibility that it's going to have a negative effect on public trust. And so this data is from work with Aleks, Amanda Tieber, and Nicole Goodman. And so this refers to what I was talking about a few moments ago, the 2018 Ontario municipal election. So I had a survey running at the time with, I believe it was 31 municipalities on election day. And I believe it was 7 or 8 of those municipalities were affected, meaning that they were working with the vendor whose system went down on election day, and some of them were prevented from voting. So what we did is we created 2 groups to see if there was an effect on trust. Group 1 is everyone who voted before 5:30 p.m. on election day in 2018. That's around the time that Aleks observed that things were starting to slow down as he was monitoring HTTP traffic. I think that's what it's called, Aleks. And so those people are in group 1. And then group 2 is everyone who voted after. Now, some of these people would have voted that evening, but most of these people would have voted the next day. And presumably these people would know about the incident because they're voting after the election is supposed to have ended, right? And you can see the differences in trust here. Sorry, not in trust, in satisfaction, in likelihood to recommend to others. So we asked people, one of the questions is, how satisfied are you with the online voting process? You can see that people who voted in group 1 said they weren't, 94% said they were satisfied. And in group 2, 73% said they were satisfied. And similarly, the group that's not satisfied increases. And these Z values just basically say that the differences between these percentages are statistically significant. We also ran this data looking at just voters in group 2 whose municipalities had declared a state of emergency, and the differences were even greater, which is, to be expected. And you can see differences not quite as great as satisfaction, but, would they be likely to recommend it to others? You see likelihood go down in those that were affected. And then similar changes in other statements. So, I mean, what this says to me is that, technical incidents can have an effect on public attitudes. While this doesn't speak necessarily to trust specifically, it could affect public trust. And why this is important is because we know that if people are more trustworthy of, local political officials and political institutions, they are more likely to participate. And so if they lose trust, then they're going to be eventually less likely to participate and also engage in other ways. And so, it's really important. And this was a minor incident compared to some of the things that potentially could happen. Other barriers, not to glaze over these, but some people say that older electors won't use it. This is a myth, completely a myth. They're actually the biggest users. Some people say ballot secrecy. For example, if I'm sitting in the kitchen trying to vote and my husband's over my shoulder, that shouldn't be going on. Fraud or coercion. You can have situations of family voting where, maybe I'm the domineering family member in my house and I say to my husband, you better vote for this candidate. So there are solutions for that. Estonia has a good workaround where you can vote as many times as you like to cancel out the vote. Authentication, auditability, that refers to verification, security threats. I mean, the example that I talked about today, was more of a third-party issue with the hookup of the internet, but of course there can be like denial of service attacks, which has happened in some political party, online votes, hacking, phishing, etc. The identification of clear requirements, and then procurement. And procurement basically refers to how we tender these online voting vendors. So how are, any government, how are they requesting this service, and how are they then vetting vendors to ensure that they are providing, the best security possible. And wanted to just say a word about developing standards, and happy to talk about this in the Q&A. So standards are in development, and hopefully they will be out in 2023. If not, they'll be out in early 2024. These standards will be voluntary and they will apply to municipalities across the country. The goal is that these standards will provide a baseline that can then be built up at provincial and territorial levels of government and eventually federal levels of government. You know, I personally think it's really important to have standards in place. Even if the federal government isn't using online voting, I think it's better to be proactive rather than reactive, which we typically see our governments being. And then just to conclude, so sorry, I had to be a little brief there. So I haven't been able to speak to all the promises and pitfalls, but those that I did mention really highlight this tension between accessibility and security that online voting presents. And, you know, both are risks, I think. Online voting or any technology is not going to be the overall solution to any issue. That's technological solutionism, and it never seems to work out. We saw that with COVID. But not modernizing electoral systems or, you know, aspects of elections isn't really serving electors either in the current circumstance. And in fact, it could be in some cases even further marginalizing vulnerable groups who are disproportionately affected during times of crisis, like in the pandemic, for example, or even in the post-pandemic environment. So I think the answer lies somewhere in the middle with slow and steady development. And I wanted to end on an analogy. Aleks started with a story and I'm going to end with one. So there's a story in Canada about a young man. His name's Kyle McDonald. And Kyle had a red paperclip for a trade and he posted it online. And after 14 trades, Kyle exchanged a role in a movie for a Canadian farmhouse. So this was quite the up level in trading. And the relevance to voting reform here is that Kyle didn't trade the paperclip for the house. He worked his way up to the house in a series of trades, each time trading for a more valuable object. And that's really how the future of technology and elections needs to work. It needs to be slow and steady, deliberate steps. And with the right planning and discussion, maybe it could take us from the paperclip to, you know, the electoral integrity of a house. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to end this.
Thank you very much, Nicole. That was terrific. Thank you both. Any questions or comments or thoughts? Thanks again. That was stimulating and informative. I guess I will just, I mean, we got a very skeptical approach from Dr. Essex, and Dr. Goodman, are you a little more optimistic? I guess I'll just open things up with asking that question.
Well, I tried to be balanced in my talk, but, you know, obviously initially I was focused more on the social sciences aspects like turnout and participation. And yes, that does show benefits, but there are real risks that need to be discussed as part of this. And I really tried to highlight that balance in my presentation. And, you know, that is part of the fantastic work that I, you know, am so grateful to do with Aleks, is that, you know, we have this research partnership where we both see different sides, and it really lends itself to more balanced policy development.
Terrific. Thanks. Yeah, fantastic. I thought I saw Michael Judd's hand go up. I don't know, but I see also Vicky Schmolka and Kathleen O'Hara. So if Michael, if you want to speak, please raise your hand or just give us a shout. But for now, I'll hand it over to Vicky. Thanks.
Thank you. I would like to ask Dr. Essex if he ever sees the possibility of hack-free online voting, or if this is the incrementalism that Dr. Goodman is talking about is really not within range. Like it's never going to be a completely safe system.
It's not about being hack-free, or, I mean, that's, you know, there's a lot of talk about, you know, hackers and cybersecurity and so forth. At the end of the day, the thing just has to do what it's designed to do, right? If you have a toilet, it's just got to flush, right? You have a car, it's just got to start and take you to work. You have an election system, it's just got to produce a result. But under the auspices of, you know, a democratic election, it has to be a result that is somehow believable to the public, especially to the people that lose. And I'm saying to a reasonable person, you know, this like notion in law of like a reasonable person. So with that in mind, it has to at least not be worse than what we already have at the federal level, or what we had at the municipal level until we changed away. So we had a paper ballot. We counted it up. It's not perfect. It has its own limitations, but it has the advantage of being dead simple. You can watch it. You can see it with your own eyes. You don't really have to know anything or do anything except just sit there and watch it. So if we're going to change away from that, which is what we're doing, we need to replace that standard of evidence with some other standard of evidence. But what's not okay is no evidence, which is what, unfortunately, we are seeing in many of these municipalities. I mean, if you ran in the race and lost, or at least you're told that you lost, and you maybe don't feel like you do, are you going to take the company's word for it, right? I mean, like, it's not that we don't trust the company. I know many of the vendors, they're good people. At a personal level, I think a lot of them are just decent folks trying to do the right thing. That's not the point. The point is that it's a democratic election. We shouldn't have to place trust in a single person to declare an outcome, especially one that, municipal politics has a lot riding on it. There's a lot of financial, contracts, land development deals. I mean, people tell me about this stuff all the time. It's just not appropriate. There's like an international norm of what a democratic election looks like, and it's got to involve some kind of evidence. So if we can solve the question of evidence, I think we're in a lot farther, a much better place. And to that end, there are, ways of producing kind of a digital version of this, but it's kind of advanced stuff. It uses mathematics and cryptography. Microsoft is developing one of these systems. Swiss Post in Switzerland is developing a system like this. And there are vendors in Canada like this. What's missing in Canada, and especially in Ontario, are any laws, any standards, or any political will to do anything about this gap of evidence.
Can I just ask, you're using the word evidence where I would use the words verifiability or the word verifiability. Is there a reason that evidence is different from being able to verify?
So I think that's a fair word to use. Evidence is sort of the product of the verifiability. So I think that language is perfectly fine with me. The principles of the Municipal Elections Act say that there should be certainty that the results that are declared are reflective of the votes that were cast. So my question to the cities using online voting is, tell me how a losing candidate can be certain that they lost without appealing to your authority. I've not heard an answer to that from many of these cities. The CBC interview always kind of starts with me saying, well, here's the 5 cybersecurity things I'm worried about. And then they always say, well, we're confident. And it's sort of like, well, that's fantastic, you're confident, but why should we be confident too? Take us on the journey, right? Open the books and show us, right? In the United States, for example, they use optical scan tabulators, right? So if you watched the American news in the last 2 years, you might have heard some people saying, I don't believe the election result, blah, blah, blah. The way that they dealt with that is they said, okay, here are all of our paper ballots. Let's go back and audit them, do risk limiting audits, do recounts. And so they have a system there to deal with those allegations. In that context, if someone were to hypothetically challenge an election in an online case, what evidence would they bring forward to say, no, it's fine?
Thanks. Kathleen O'Hara.
Hi, thanks so much, Christine, for inviting these guests and everything else you do. I was actually, one of the reasons I'm asking this question is because of what Michael Judd said. I'm out of the country, and I and another friend out of the country just couldn't vote. We tried, I got through to Kingston elections, somebody there, and we just couldn't vote. So what kind of recourse can people, because Michael said he knew quite a few people. I mean, how many of us in Kingston didn't manage to vote? And how credible was the election? And what recourse do we have after the vote is over? I mean, I almost feel like putting an ad in the Whig Standard and saying, could you come forward if you weren't able to vote? And we'll see how credible the vote was. Our mayor, I think, got in with 16% of the vote. That's not very democratic.
This question is also an issue with mail-in voting as well. In the Canadian federal election, the last one, 2021, they had many ballots that did not ended up being counted because they arrived simply too late. Of course, you know, I don't know what went on with the, so were you voting online or were you voting via mail?
No, I was trying to vote online.
Okay. And so what?
But then eventually they said there were 2 Kathleen O'Haras. So there was nothing I could do. But my friend wasn't able to vote. And as I said, I don't know what was the situation with Michael's friends. But
so in your case, they said there were two people with your name. Did that mean that they didn't send you a voting card with the PIN number on it?
I did have that card and I did have the PIN number, but it still didn't work.
So when you tried to log in, it just said there's an error?
Yes.
Okay.
And I finally, as I said, I finally got through to a city official and that was their excuse. There were 2 Kathleen O'Haras. They didn't, by then I'd pretty well given up.
So, you know, this is not, obviously, I'm sure that there are more than one Kathleen O'Haras in the world. I know that in my case, my sister and her sister-in-law have the exact same name, okay? Because she took her husband's last name and his sister kept the name. So they went on a trip together and they were on the same flight. And it was like total pandemonium because there were 2 people with the same name. So it does bring the system to its knees sometimes. Now, fortunately, the root cause of some of this disruption and fragility in the system is due to it using property records, and that's eventually going to be it's going to be mitigated when it switches over to using Elections Ontario's voter rolls. So we might expect to see better outcomes in terms of these kind of situations in the next cycle. And what you're describing is not, like, I've heard lots of stories like this, you know, people getting sent multiple cards because they own properties around the province, people getting sent cards to the family home they grew up in, even though they live in some other city. There was even the infamously the case of the dead dog in Mono, Ontario last cycle that got a voter information card. So we're hoping that's going to get cleaned up when Elections Ontario takes over. I see Nicole wanting to jump in here.
I was just going to say, though, that the issue of the voter notification cards isn't just an online voting issue. Like it's been an issue for any type of voting, and it can be an issue for, especially for any type of remote voting, right?
But could I don't want to take up too much time, but what recourse do we have? I mean, a bunch of us were disenfranchised. Is there anything we can do? I mean,
what was the credential used in Kingston, Alex? Was it date of birth that you had to enter, Kathleen?
Well, no, in this case, what Kathleen's describing is logging into the system, but it just simply said there was a problem or an error or something, right?
Right. Well, I don't want to deal with my situation, but it sounds like quite a few of us were disenfranchised for one reason or another. And I just wonder, is there any recourse? Or, I mean, what happens to elections? Anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, so just for everyone's armchair legal entertainment, and you know, again, I'm not a lawyer, but I am a kind of a armchair scholar of the Municipal Elections Act. That is the document under which all of this would fall under. So, you know, there might be a clause under that Act that is relevant to this case. It's just that, for whatever reason, any kind of litigation under the Municipal Elections Act is on this topic is just weirdly beyond reach, or at least historically up to this moment has been beyond reach. It's sort of like, it's this example of like, well, we think that the company might have done, we don't know what's going on. We need to look at their books. We can't look at their books if you don't have evidence. Well, we can't get the evidence because it's in their books. And there's a kind of a chicken and egg keeping us from moving forward. So I think that to answer your question sort of in a roundabout way, I'm not sure there is a recourse at this point. There has to be something that just rises to a big enough bar that it would somehow raise the eyebrows of the judge. And we haven't seen what that threshold is yet. A lot of this is untested in any kind of legal sense.
Well, I'll just jump in here a bit. I know we're coming up to 8 o'clock. Is it okay with our guests? We stay on for just a few more minutes because we have a couple more questions.
I'm happy to talk about this all day.
Is that okay with you, Nicole? I know you've got.
Yeah, you could probably hear my kids at first. My husband took them out of the house, so they'll be back in about 10 minutes.
Okay, all right, we better. So thank you. Thanks for the extra time. And I'll just mention that there were a couple of comments. One, some pertaining to our previous meeting. Sorry, Susanna, we didn't raise that, but let's move on with the questions pertaining to our panel. Vicky Schmolka does ask whether our guests have any recommendations for what to request in a review of the audit of the 2022 election. So what sorts of things might you recommend? And I notice also that Nicole has reached out to you, Kathleen, to get your particular story. But I'll leave you with that query from Vicky in the chat just for a moment, because I'd like to get to Michael Judd. So you've been waiting patiently.
There we go. Yeah, thank you. Very much in agreement with much of what Alexander said in the first part there about evidences and so on, and where is the validity in some of it. But most of my concerns personally revolve around disenfranchising certain elements of the population. And when there is a challenge, it actually drives voter apathy further. And I'm very concerned at the amount of challenges that we had in our election, at least in my district or in Kingston. I don't know about the rest of the province or country in their elections. But when somebody tries a number of times to vote and it's unsuccessful, they just don't vote. They don't get in their car and drive to the polling station. They just say, screw it, and they don't go. So that's a very significant problem. Also, with there's a large percentage of the population that don't have internet access, and they feel very disenfranchised. The unhoused, people in lower income situations that don't even have internet access, things like that. And so if we put too much reliance in this system at this point in time, I see that as a real challenge, and it puts forth a challenge to the validity of the actual election. And yeah, I've got some real concerns about it. I think it's great, and I think we need to pursue it. But there seems to be a real challenge, and the amount of people that contacted me saying that I could not vote, it was huge. We're not talking a handful or two. We're talking buckets of people.
It'd be interesting to understand all of the different modalities of the failures to vote, because I imagine if you had that many people, they were experiencing different things prevail. What probably was not a single thing, right? Like it was probably a basket of things. I mean,
there were two or three that kept coming up.
Okay.
Some of it was in regards to names. There was a broad range, as you mentioned, but it was mainly just 2 or 3 items. It was just basically getting bumped out was the biggest one. They're trying to just they're partway through and then boom, gone.
And this is on the internet system, not the telephone system?
Yeah, this was internet. Yeah.
Okay, this is
The system would bump them off,
Can
and
I,
so they go back on and try. Yeah, go ahead.
I wonder if maybe what we might do is have Colleen ask her question then, and then give Nicole a chance to offer her thoughts, and then Alex, I'm just worried that Nicole's kids are going to show up ready for bed.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
My kids were already driving RC cars outside while Nicole was talking, so I already had to go out and yell at them to simmer down. So.
Well, appreciate both of you giving up your evenings. Thank you. Colleen, do you want to hop into the conversation?
Yeah, and I agree with what Kathleen and with Michael have said. I have heard that I voted in person, which is just probably, like we talked about it, it's a novelty thing. It's something I've always done. And especially since I was running, I felt it's something I wanted to do. But I had heard from friends as well that did have difficulty voting online. But my question was more about the integrity of the voter registry when we require the actual people to sort of correct the data on the system. We're not really doing censuses anymore and finding out about who lives at each address. And I'm just wondering about how many people have not lived at addresses for a very long time, and yet the voter poll is never updated. I'm just sort of wondering about if there's been any research or analysis into that. I'm just sort of curious, because as somebody who works with databases and systems, I know how manual it can be to try to keep on top of keeping data up to date and accurate. And I'm just wondering, in a province like Ontario, really how much effort is being made to keep this data up to date. Thank you.
Thanks. And then I'll just mention all the two questions again. Vicky's question about what our guests would recommend be the elements of an audit of the 2022 election. And then Susanna Clift Youngling has asked about what the proportion of online voting was to in-person voting. So there's a handful of questions. Maybe, do you want to get started, Nicole?
Sure. So I was just going to respond to Michael's question. And I know this is going to be a really unpopular statement among this crowd, but I mean, I think the points that he made are important and valid, but it's half a dozen of one, half a dozen of the other. And I think I feel especially strongly about this since my brain injury, because without having these additional, more accessible ways of voting, there's other people that can be excluded from the process too. And, I'm really struck by this one story about a lady living in a First Nation who had to travel to a poll location in person by paper, and she had to pay for a cab to get there. And she lived in a low-income area, and she had to choose between paying for a cab there and back to cast a ballot or feeding her children for a week. And of course, she chose to feed her children for a week. And had online voting been in place, that individual would have been able to cast a ballot. So, I mean, I think when we're having these conversations that we need to remember that there are people who face barriers in paper voting elections, and to not acknowledge that is coming from a place of privilege. So I think we need to balance the conversation while acknowledging, the very real issue of digital literacy and how that can be a barrier. And there are a lot of best practices that can help overcome that. But that said, fully eliminating paper voting is probably not serving, a segment of the population who either wants that experience or, maybe they can afford the internet, but they don't have the experience because they haven't, they just haven't been around the internet that long, or because they're lower income and they either can't afford a connection or they can't afford a good quality connection that will allow them to facilitate the vote. That was the only comment I was fired up about. In terms of the other comment from Suzanne. So Suzanne, I can tell you that in most municipalities that use the 3 voting methods, or even the 2 voting methods, 2 being paper and online, the majority of voters typically cast an online ballot in 99% of cases. I don't have the exact percentage here, but I'll look it up now while Alex answers.
So and then of course in regards to what Nicole's saying, I think it's also important to remember that the conversation is not about online versus paper. accessible versus inaccessible. It's about, an election that, offers some kind of evidence of it being counted up correctly. And if that person had have hypothetically paid their week's salary to take a cab to vote, and the vote was counted up in a transparent way, or they cast a ballot online and you're just left to take someone's word for it, it's not clear that the remote solution would necessarily put them ahead, especially if there, heaven forbid, ever was, and this has happened before in the history of the world, fraud in the declaration of the results, or even just errors, right? Undetected errors in the results. If you are literally reduced to just taking someone's word for an election outcome, it could be mooted whether you had franchise or not. It's possible to disenfranchise everyone in one fell swoop if there was fraud.
So what sorts of things do you think the city of Kingston or any municipality ought to be doing to try to address these obstacles to fully accessible voting systems, fully accessible, secure, reliable voting systems? What would be the things that you would recommend municipalities ought to do, particularly if they're trying to audit the previous election and troubleshoot and figure out how to avoid those problems next time?
Nicole, do you want to go ahead?
Sorry, I was writing Suzanne back in the chat. I'd missed what that was. I was just answering her question. Sorry.
What should we do to, what could Kingston do to make it more verifiable, more trustworthy, just strengthen everything, build capacity, so forth?
So I think to be able to answer that honestly, I would need to know exactly what Kingston did in the election, and I don't know that. So I mean, I'm happy to chat, not tonight, but separately with someone if you want to tell me what went on. Certainly, I can tell you that Aleks and I are working with some colleagues to help inform. I don't want to say improve the integrity of digital elections. We have a research project with a colleague, Holly Ann Garnett, who is actually a professor at RMC in Kingston. And we are looking at different types of voting systems and municipal policies and trying to make suggestions for process and security that would help improve things. So I don't believe Kingston is on our list of communities that we're working with, but we will be generating a public report that will have findings and will be advertised and distributed across the municipal community, and will hopefully be able to improve things. There's always room for improvement, right?
Okay, so just to jump on top of that about audits, unfortunately, in the context of an online election, that is not one of these elections that's kind of producing an evidentiary trail, the notion of a recount or a risk limiting audit or something like that is not necessarily going to produce a meaningful result. If you have a system that hypothetically, was to produce a false result, either due to programming error or actual intentional fraud, the Municipal Elections Act basically says to do a recount, you just have to run the whole thing over again, right? Well, if the thing was corrupted to begin with, it'll just produce the same result, or at least you won't necessarily expect to find out anything different. So, running an audit in those circumstances, it's not the same thing if you have a paper trail. So what they do in the US is they have these tabulators, right? And the tabulators read the ballots, and sometimes they get it wrong. And so, some people believe that the ghost of South American dictators flipping bits in the memory or something like that, and who knows? Okay, so but the way you deal with that is you go back to the paper, and these companies will say exactly the same thing, which is that the paper's the ground truth, and you go and look at what the paper says, and if it matches the totals, then you've you've established the correctness of the election. So what does that look like in an online setting? So there are methods, advanced, cryptographic techniques that can potentially do this. Elections Nova Scotia has an online voting RFP where they're going to be looking at these cryptographic systems. Elections Quebec is looking at this, and then other countries as well.
So I just see that Nicole's about to go. So I wanted to make sure that we said thank you very much and goodbye, Nicole. Thanks for giving us your evening and your insights. It was terrific. Really great.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye, Nicole.
And we probably should wrap up before too long. Thank you, Aleks. But I'll just see if there's yeah, the candy salesman, Kathleen O'Hara, thinks that metaphor is coming back to haunt us here. I mean, it does sound as what you're saying, Aleks, is that the very reason that the election isn't verifiable is the very reason why the election can't be audited. So that's quite a vicious circle.
And it is frustrating because again, there are certain things in society where everyone would just be like, well, you can't do that. Like no reasonable person is going to say you can just refuse the CRA's request to audit your books. Everyone's going to be like, oh, of course, your goose is cooked. You got to open the books. There's no reasonable person that would say that an individual could escape the scrutiny of taxation. The tax person gets their due. So what is the problem with holding an election to the same standard that we hold individuals with their taxation? I mean, this is like what elections are supposed to be, and are in fact in many other areas. Like, so for example, federally, Elections Canada, no issue there. They do it well. They do it right. I have full confidence in how they approach it. I don't know what else to do better. If we're going to do an online setting, okay, fine, but we have to deal with some of this stuff. I'm honestly, I don't understand how it's gone on for so many years in Ontario without being challenged. The only thing that occurs to me, the only reason why it's gone on for so long is just because there hasn't been a scandal that has risen to the public consciousness yet. And also the technology, it's hard to understand how this technology works, right? But when my colleague Dr. Goodman was talking about people's perceptions of privacy being increased because they can vote #vote naked as the Guelph or the Cambridge candidate. That was a real thing, by the way. He had a whole so it's more private, except for the fact that our own research has found that in many cases the vendor knows how you voted, right? They have enough information, if not the information directly, to associate your identity with your vote. Third-party cloud providers are able to access that information in some instances. We published research on that. We just published a paper where somebody sitting on the internet can tell how you voted just by the length of the internet traffic going by. So, when cities make these unqualified claims, there's no way to crack the secrecy of the ballot. It's like saying, there's no side effects in the drug. It's like, well, of course, there's going to be some side effects, some asterisks somewhere. And we're just kind of not in a place where we're even acknowledging that there are asterisks. And so if we could have an honest conversation about this, we could move forward. I don't know how long it's going to take us to get there, but we're still working on it.
Thanks. Maybe one more question before we wrap up. Susanna, you have a question, I see.
Yeah, and sorry, I don't want to prolong it too long, but I was just wondering, so in what jurisdictions does it work? Who's got it right? And you mentioned the federal government, but that's not online, right? So where do you so for example, I was just thinking when you mentioned the electronic voting and in Brazil, for example, I was just fascinated how quickly they could have a result on a vote. So I'm not sure if that's online voting or just electronic kind of voting. But so what jurisdiction got it right and does online voting well, I guess I would say.
Well, so that's actually kind of an open question because as Nicole mentioned in the beginning of your talk, we're kind of like the world leaders in this right now. We're world leaders in adoption, but not really in like the governing legislation. Now, in terms of who gets it right, instead of focusing on a specific system, I'd rather focus on maybe laws. So here are the standards for e-voting from the Council of Europe. And they say all kinds of reasonable and sober things. The voting system should do X, the voting system should do Y. This is how it should work. So that's something we can build a best system off of. Similarly, in Switzerland, they have these ordinances on electronic voting. It's kind of like, it's kind of like this EU version, but the Swiss version. And the Federal Chancellery of Switzerland has a division called the Voting Rights Division, and their job is just to make sure everyone's franchise is respected. So they actually draft laws, and they have technologically, they have cryptographers in the Federal Chancellery helping to craft these laws that are reflective of the real technology. And now Swiss Post is one of the companies that's building this, and we've been evaluating their system. And I would say that, from what I've seen so far, I think they've got the best shot of making this work, but it kind of comes from the top, right? It has to come from the top. There has to. So to the question of what can Kingston do, I'm not sure if Kingston by themselves really can solve this problem. I mean, in a perfect world, we would have a federal agency like the US or Switzerland or whatever that brought all of the knowledge together and actually had technocrats help craft this in a way that makes legal sense and technical sense, like they do at the US Election Assistance Commission, or similarly in Switzerland and elsewhere. But we're not going to get that maybe ever in our lifetimes. So we have to look to the province to intervene. And I'm not sure if you've been following this government, but they've kind of been going in the opposite direction on the voting rights side. I live in London, Ontario. We had a ranked choice ballot last cycle, and for no reason that anyone that I know can discern, they canceled ranked choice voting. I mean, we don't know why. So we're not hopeful that they're going to help us renew the laws. The Municipal Elections Act does not mention the words online, electronics, internet, network, secure. I mean, it was written in the Windows 95 era, and there's no acknowledgement. It just basically says, you can do all of this paper voting the way we've always done it, or something else. And then the clerk writes their own laws. And the clerks, God bless them, they're great people, but this is really a bigger problem than any one city. And it's going to take, a provincial, ideally a federal level intervention to sort of set this on the right track.
That was a very sobering note to end on, but really useful to have these thoughts and these cautionary tales in mind. So thank you very much, Dr. Essex. That was really stimulating and informative and sobering. And yeah, thank you very much again. Thanks for giving up time from your family and your free evening. That was really wonderful. And thank you everyone for attending and asking such great questions, sharing your stories, and happy holidays, happy New Year. We'll see you in 2023. Take good care, and thanks again, everyone. Thank you very much. Aleks, thanks a lot.